Mark Ellison was 61 when the desert finally grew quiet enough for him to hear his own breathing again. The small ranch outside northern Arizona sat far from highways, where mornings arrived gently and the wind carried dust instead of noise. Retirement had not softened him. It had only slowed his steps, not his thoughts. He lived with an old cattle dog named Rufus, gray around the muzzle but sharp in the eyes. Rufus followed Mark everywhere, not out of training but habit built over years of shared silence. They moved through days like a practiced routine, man and dog stitched together by time. Mark's past was something neighbors guessed at but never asked about. A former wildlife responder, they said, someone who had seen too much loss to stay in the field. The truth lingered in the way he paused at distant sirens, or how his gaze hardened whenever the land went suddenly still. One early spring morning, the stillness broke. Rufus stopped at the edge of a dry ravine, hackles raised, ears fixed on a sound Mark almost missed. It was faint, thin, and wrong for the open desert. Not a bird, not wind, something smaller, struggling to breathe. Mark climbed down the slope carefully, stones sliding under his boots. Beneath a mesquite bush, he found them huddled together. 3 bobcat kittens, eyes barely open, ribs showing through dusty fur. Their mother was nowhere in sight, and Mark already knew what that absence usually meant. He told himself to walk away. Nature had rules, and he had spent decades respecting them. Interfering often made things worse. Still, his hands trembled as the smallest kitten tried to crawl toward his warmth. Its cry thin as cracked glass. Rufus surprised him then. The old dog stepped forward without command, lying down beside the kittens. He lowered his head, letting them press against his chest, breathing slow and steady. The sound that came from Rufus was not a growl, but something softer, almost careful. For a moment, Mark forgot the desert. The scene pulled him backward in time. 2 nights in rescue tents and animals that trusted him when they should not have. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. That mix of responsibility and fear he had sworn to leave behind. A truck engine echoed from the road above. It was Helen Brooks, a neighboring rancher, stopping for her usual check-in. She saw Mark below, the kittens, the dog, and shook her head slowly. "You know what this leads to," she said, not unkindly. Mark nodded, because he did know. He also knew he was already past the point of turning back. The kittens were alive because something had chosen to care, and that something was now looking at him, waiting. Rufus met his eyes, calm and certain. They carried the kittens up together, Helen silent beside him. Mark felt the old ache return, but it was different this time. Less sharp, more deliberate. He told himself this was temporary, just until the kittens were strong enough to leave. That night, as the desert cooled, Mark watched Rufus curl around the 3 small bodies, shielding them from the cold. The fire cracked softly, shadows moving along the walls. Mark sat awake longer than usual, uneasy, aware that something had begun. He did not know yet how deeply this choice would mark him, only that the quiet he had built his life around was already changing, reshaped by 3 fragile heartbeats and 1 aging dog who seemed to understand more than he should. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm Mark had not planned for. He rose before sunrise, warming milk replacer on the stove while the desert still held its breath. Rufus waited patiently beside the crate, tail thumping once, as if reminding Mark this routine was now shared, not owned. Mark built a small enclosure near the house, using old fencing and canvas to keep the kittens safe. He moved slowly, mindful of every sound he made. The bobcats watched him with cloudy eyes, unaware of species or danger, responding only to warmth, hunger, and Rufus's steady presence. Helen returned often, bringing supplies she claimed were leftovers, though Mark knew better. She spoke lightly, but her eyes tracked the kitten's growth with concern. Each visit ended the same way, her voice lowered, warning him that wildlife officials would not see this as kindness. Mark said little in response. He had lived long enough to know when words would fail. Instead, he watched Rufus teach the kittens how to move, how to pause, how to listen. The old dog corrected them gently, nudging off play into calmer shapes. By the 3rd week, the kittens had found their strength. They climbed over Rufus like he was part of the land itself, biting his ears and tail. Rufus accepted it all, eyes half closed, patient as stone. Mark felt something loosen inside his chest watching them. The emotional peak came without warning. One afternoon, the largest kitten hissed at Mark, a sharp, wild sound that cut through the calm. Mark froze, heart racing, recognizing the shift he had been expecting and fearing. This was no longer rescue, this was transition. That night, Mark barely slept. He sat on the porch, memories pressing in, recalling animals he had saved only to lose later. Rufus lay at his feet, breathing deep, unbothered. The kittens paced inside the enclosure, restless, testing boundaries they did not yet understand. 2 days later, a white truck appeared on the road. A wildlife officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Helen stood near him, tense but silent. Mark felt the desert narrow around him as questions were asked. Rules recited, and consequences implied without cruelty. Mark did not argue. He listened, nodding, his face calm while his thoughts churned. He explained the circumstances plainly, emphasizing the mother's absence, the kitten's condition. The officer glanced toward Rufus, brow furrowed, clearly unsettled by what he saw. In the end, the officer offered time. Limited, conditional time, enough to stabilize the kittens before relocation. Relief washed over Mark, tempered by the knowledge of what relocation truly meant. Temporary safety rarely promised gentle outcomes. As the truck disappeared, the desert exhaled again. Helen placed a hand on Mark's arm, saying nothing. He stood there, watching Rufus return to the kittens, resuming his quiet guardianship as if nothing had changed. That evening, Mark adjusted the enclosure, making it stronger, taller. He worked until his hands ached, driven by urgency he could not name. The kittens watched him from the shadows, eyes brighter now, more aware, less forgiving. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Mark sat back, exhaustion settling in. Rufus curled beside the kittens, forming a living wall between them and the dark. Mark understood then that time was moving faster than he wished, and still he stayed. Morning returned with a different weight. Mark noticed it in the way the air pressed closer to the ground, in how Rufus rose slower than before. The enclosure held shadows now, corners the kittens slipped into when Mark approached. Growth had sharpened them, not just in size, but in instinct. Mark adjusted his habits without thinking. He stopped reaching first, letting the kittens come to him. He moved tools instead of hands, sounds instead of touch. Rufus watched closely, positioning himself between man and wildness, as if translating a language neither side fully understood. A young woman arrived one afternoon in a dust-covered sedan. She introduced herself as Lily, a wildlife rehab volunteer sent to assess the kitten's progress. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes lingered on the bobcats longer than necessary. Measuring what Mark tried not to name, Lily spoke of timelines and thresholds, of moments when care becomes interference. Mark listened, nodding, though each word scraped something old inside him. He had crossed lines before, not out of defiance, but love that refused to wait for permission. The kittens no longer slept piled together. They chose distance, claiming corners, watching Rufus with something between trust and challenge. When they played, it turned sharp quickly. Rufus corrected them once, firmly, and the sound that followed froze Mark where he stood. That sound marked the emotional peak, a low warning growl from a kitten barely 3 months old. It echoed longer than it should have. Mark felt the truth settle in his bones. These animals were learning who they were, and it no longer included him. That night, Mark dreamed of fences that moved on their own, shifting farther away each time he reached them. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, Rufus already alert beside him. The desert was quiet, but it felt like listening rather than sleeping. Lily returned the next day with heavier news. Transfer plans were forming. A facility up north, controlled release, maybe. Her tone stayed professional, but she softened when she mentioned Rufus. She had never seen anything like this bond, and it unsettled her. Mark spent the afternoon repairing old trails behind the property, clearing paths the bobcats could follow one day. Rufus trailed him, slower now, breathing deeper. The kittens watched from a rise, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. A sudden movement broke the calm. One kitten lunged toward Rufus, not playful, not cruel, just testing. Rufus stood his ground. No sound, no retreat. The moment passed, but it left a bruise on Mark's chest he could not rub away. As evening settled, Mark sat with Lily on the porch. They spoke little. Some truths didn't need language. The desert cooled, stars arriving one by one, patient and distant. Later, Mark returned to the enclosure alone. He did not touch the fence. He only watched. The kittens moved with quiet confidence now, eyes bright, bodies ready. Rufus lay nearby, close enough to guard, far enough to let go, but Mark stayed there until the moon climbed high. He understood something then, not as acceptance, but clarity. Love did not always mean holding on. Sometimes it meant preparing yourself for the moment when staying would do more harm than leaving. The morning arrived quietly, almost apologetic. Mark woke before the light, listening to Rufus breathe beside the door. The desert felt stretched thin, like something waiting to be decided. Mark moved through his routine slowly, aware that every small habit was becoming a memory in progress. He noticed how the kittens no longer tracked his steps. Their attention stayed outward now, ears tuned to wind and distant movement. Rufus remained close to them, but even he was no longer their center. Mark felt like a visitor walking through a place he once owned. Lily returned with a second truck, this one carrying equipment and forms. She spoke gently, explaining the next evaluations. Her words were careful, shaped to soften impact. Mark nodded, focusing on the ground beneath her boots. Knowing this was not yet the end but no longer the middle, the enclosure felt smaller that day. Mark stepped inside to adjust a latch and felt 3 sets of eyes lock onto him. No fear, no affection, just awareness. Rufus shifted between them, steady but alert. Mark backed away, hands open, heart pounding harder than he expected. The emotional peak came when one kitten charged a fence as Mark turned, not attacking, not fleeing, just claiming space. The sound of claws on wire cut through him. Lily froze. Rufus barked once, sharp and final, restoring order but not comfort. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Mark stepped back fully, leaning on the fence for support. He understood then that what he felt was not rejection, it was success. The kittens no longer needed him, and that truth carried its own kind of grief. That afternoon, Mark drove into town alone. He bought supplies he might not use and coffee he forgot to drink. Faces passed him without recognition. He felt strangely hollow, like a house already packed for someone else to move into. When he returned, Rufus greeted him with tired relief. The dog's movements were slower now, his eyes softer. Mark knelt beside him, resting a hand on familiar fur, grounding himself in something that had not changed yet. As dusk approached, Lily shared final dates. Transfer was coming sooner than expected. Weather windows and logistics rarely waited for hearts to catch up. Mark listened without interruption, storing each detail with quiet precision that night. Mark cooked a simple meal and ate it standing. The kittens watched from a distance, their bodies framed by fading light. Rufus lay between them and the dark, faithful even as his role shifted toward its final shape. Mark spent hours sitting on the porch, thinking of beginnings that never asked permission, and endings that never asked forgiveness. The stars arrived slowly, unbothered by human timelines. Before sleeping, Mark checked the enclosure one last time. He did not speak, he did not reach, he simply stood there, bearing witness to what love had become. When he finally lay down, Rufus at his side, Mark felt a fragile calm settle in. Nothing was resolved, but something was understood, and for now that was enough to let the night pass. The week began with unusual quiet. Mark noticed it in the way the birds stayed distant and the wind avoided the porch. Rufus slept more, shifting only when the kittens stirred. Mark found himself matching that stillness, moving through mornings like he was careful not to wake something fragile. The kittens had grown leaner, sharper, their movements efficient and precise. They no longer responded to Rufus's corrections the same way. Sometimes they ignored him entirely. Mark watched from afar, recognizing a familiar pattern. Independence always arrived before readiness, and it never asked permission. Tot Helen stopped by unexpectedly, carrying old photographs she thought Mark should see again. They sat at the kitchen table, light slanting across the images. Younger animals, younger Mark. Each photo felt like proof that time never stayed, loyal to good intentions. She spoke gently about Rufus, about age and limits. Mark listened, fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. He already knew. Rufus had begun limping slightly by evening, his breathing heavier after patrols. Still, the dog refused to leave the enclosure unattended. The emotional peak came one afternoon, when a distant howl carried across the land. The kittens reacted instantly, bodies taut, eyes fixed, toward the hills. Rufus tried to block them, stepping forward, but they slipped past him, reaching the fence with wild focus. One kitten leaped, striking the wire hard enough to rattle it. Rufus barked, sharp and strained, collapsing the moment into chaos. Mark ran, heart racing, shouting Rufus's name. The dog stood his ground, but his legs trembled beneath him. Mark reached Rufus just as the kittens retreated, not defeated, simply finished. Rufus leaned against him, breath shallow, eyes still locked outward. Mark knelt in the dirt, holding him steady, feeling the weight of responsibility shift suddenly and completely. Lily arrived later that evening. Alarmed by Mark's call, she examined Rufus carefully, her expression tightening. The words she spoke were soft, but they landed hard. Rufus could no longer act as protector, not safely, not without risk. That night, Mark moved Rufus inside for the first time since the kittens arrived. The dog resisted weakly, confused by the separation. Mark sat with him until sleep came, listening to unfamiliar silence settle outside. The kittens paced the enclosure restlessly, searching for the familiar shape that no longer joined them. Mark watched through the window, chest heavy, knowing this fracture could not be repaired. Some bonds were meant to break before they broke everyone involved. Days passed slowly after that. Rufus rested. The kittens adapted quickly, too quickly. Mark noticed how little they seemed to look back. It hurt more than he expected. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mark sat beside Rufus, brushing his fur. He understood then that the story had changed direction. The ending was no longer about the kittens alone. It was about what remained after letting go. When darkness settled, Mark stepped onto the porch alone. The land felt wider now, emptier, but honest. He stood there quietly, accepting that love did not always get to decide how long it stayed. The days grew shorter without ceremony. Mark felt it in the way shadows reached the porch earlier, in how Rufus slept through noises that once pulled him upright. The house carried a different echo now. Outside, the kittens moved with confidence, their world no longer shaped by waiting. Mark adjusted to caring for Rufus alone. He measured pills carefully, lifted water bowls closer, spoke softly during the long afternoons. Rufus listened, tail moving once or twice, loyalty intact even as strength faded. Mark found comfort in these smaller acts, as if tending could delay what was coming. Lily called with updates about the transfer. Dates narrowed, vehicles scheduled, paperwork finalized. Mark thanked her and ended the call quickly. He walked outside and watched the kittens hunt insects near the fence, efficient and focused. They had learned fast what survival required. A storm rolled in unexpectedly one evening. Wind struck the land sideways, bending grass flat. The kittens reacted with agitation, pacing the enclosure. Rufus stirred inside, sensing disruption. Mark felt the tension rise like static, something waiting for release. The emotional peak came when a tree branch snapped and fell against the enclosure fence. The impact startled the kittens into chaos. One found a weak spot and squeezed through before Mark could reach the gate. The world narrowed to motion and instinct. Mark ran despite his age, calling out, lungs burning. The escaped kitten paused only briefly, eyes wild, then bolted toward the dark hills. Rufus barked from the porch, strained and helpless. Mark stumbled, falling hard onto the dirt. Breath knocked from him. He lay there for a moment, rain stinging his face, heart racing with fear and regret. When he pushed himself up, the land was quiet again. The kitten was gone. Not lost, he realized. Released by accident, but released nonetheless. Lily arrived later, soaked and apologetic, helping secure the enclosure. She spoke of search efforts, tracking possibilities. Mark listened, nodding, though he already understood the truth. The land rarely gave back what it claimed. That night, Mark cleaned his scraped hands and sat beside Rufus. The dog rested his head against Mark's knee, breathing slow and steady. Outside, the remaining kittens settled, the storm having passed. The world rearranged. In the morning, tracks confirmed what Mark expected. The escaped kitten had moved with purpose, not panic. Lily confirmed it quietly. Sometimes nature chose its own timing. Mark felt both relieved and hollow at once. The transfer date was moved forward, less waiting, less imagining. Mark agreed without resistance. The house felt like it was preparing to exhale something it had been holding too long. On the final afternoon before the move, Mark opened the gate slightly, standing back. The kittens watched him, assessing, then returned to their own rhythms. They did not need instruction anymore. As dusk settled, Mark closed the gate gently. Rufus slept nearby, peaceful for now. Mark sat alone on the porch, understanding that the haunting part of the ending was not what was lost, but what was allowed to leave. The morning of the transfer arrived without drama. No sirens, no speeches, just the hum of tires in the distance and a sky that refused to choose a mood. Mark stood on the porch longer than usual, hands wrapped around a cold mug, watching the land pretend this was an ordinary day. Rufus did not rise when the truck appeared. He opened one eye, tail moving once, then settled again. Mark knelt beside him, resting his forehead against the dog's. Their bond had never needed words. Today, even silence felt heavy with meaning. Lily stepped out first, careful and respectful. Two handlers followed, moving slowly, reading the space before acting. Mark noticed how the kittens watched them from the enclosure, bodies low, eyes alert. They recognized intention now, not kindness or threat, just change. The handlers prepared the crates with practiced calm. Mark signed papers with a steady hand that surprised him. Each signature felt like closing a door he had once built himself. Lily met his eyes briefly, offering nothing but presence. When the gate opened, the kittens did not rush. They paced, tested air, measured distance. One paused near Rufus, just long enough to acknowledge a shape that had once been everything. Rufus lifted his head, eyes soft. UNMOVING. The emotional peak came when the smallest kitten resisted, hissing sharply as the handler reached forward. Rufus pushed himself upright with effort, placing his body between them. The moment froze. Old protector, new reality. Mark felt his chest tighten painfully. Mark spoke then, low and steady, not commanding but grounding. The kitten's stilled eyes locked on his face for a final second. The handlers moved again, careful and precise. Rufus sank back down, breath shallow but calm.
Nice.
Crates closed, doors latched. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Mark turned away briefly, blinking hard, refusing to let this be the image that stayed. He focused instead on the weight of Rufus beside him, real and warm. The truck pulled away slowly, dust rising behind it. Mark watched until it disappeared beyond the bend. The land felt abruptly unfinished, like a sentence cut short. Lily lingered, then quietly left as well, leaving Mark alone with what remained. That afternoon, Mark cleaned the enclosure piece by piece. He did not rush. Each board, each latch carried memory. When he finished, the space looked empty, but it no longer felt wrong, just complete. As evening fell, Rufus struggled once, then settled for good beside the porch rail. Mark sat with him, brushing fur that had thinned with age. No regret surfaced, only gratitude, deep and aching. When night came, Mark stayed outside longer than usual. The stars felt closer, sharper. He understood then why the ending haunted people. It was not loss that lingered. It was knowing that love, once given freely, never truly leaves. The days after the transfer unfolded gently, like pages turning on their own. Mark returned to habits that no longer required vigilance. Coffee cooled untouched. Mornings stretched wide. The enclosure stood empty, a shape without a purpose. Yet the land seemed calmer for having held it once. Rufus lingered near the porch, sleeping through most afternoons. Mark moved his bed to catch the sun, speaking to him about small things. Wind direction, old neighbors, nothing important, everything familiar. Rufus listened with eyes closed, tail tapping once. Enough. Lily called with updates that sounded hopeful. One bobcat had adapted quickly, another resisted but learned. The third was quiet, observant. Mark thanked her and hung up slowly. News no longer pulled at him. It settled, then passed. Like weather, the emotional peak arrived without warning on a clear morning. Rufus did not rise. Mark knelt, called softly, felt the truth before he named it. There was no struggle, no pain, just an ending that arrived exactly when it meant to. Mark stayed there for a long time, hand resting on familiar fur, breathing in the shape of a life well given. When he stood, his legs shook, but his chest felt oddly steady. Grief came, but it did not rush. It knew where to wait. He'd buried Rufus beneath the cottonwood, where the land dipped just enough to hold shade. No marker, no words. The wind moved through leaves above, patient and indifferent. Mark stood until the sun shifted, then walked back alone. Weeks passed. The house adjusted. So did Mark. He repaired fences that no longer mattered and cleared trails he rarely walked. Sometimes he dreamed of movement in the dark, not loss, presence, something watching without asking to be seen. One evening near dusk, Mark noticed tracks by the fence line. Fresh, purposeful. He followed them a short distance before stopping. At the edge of the trees, a shape paused, lean, silent, familiar in a way that hurt. The bobcat met his eyes only briefly. No fear, no recognition, just awareness. Then it slipped back into shadow, leaving nothing behind but breath held too long. Mark stood there, heart steady, understanding exactly what he had been given. That night, the land felt full again. Not owned, not empty, simply alive. Mark sat on the porch, listening to sounds he no longer needed to interpret. He was not needed anymore, and somehow that felt like peace. The haunting part stayed with him, not the goodbye, not the silence. It was knowing love could shape something strong enough to walk away, and that walking away did not erase where it began. When Mark finally went inside, he left the door unlatched. The desert breathed around the house, unafraid. Somewhere beyond sight, 3 lives moved forward, carrying something old and invisible with them. And Mark let that be the ending.